On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Janet Reitman, contributing editor at Rolling Stone, on her piece on the stealth war on abortion. And it is, of course, the 41st anniversary of Roe v. Wade, Janet, and this continues to be to garner popular support, the idea that women should have control over their bodies.
Yep. Unbelievable, but true.
Yes, it's a shocking belief, but apparently there has been a shift in the way that those who believe that women are simply vessels to incubate fetuses. There's been a shift in their strategy in the way that they are trying to turn the clock back.
Yes, right. So what's happened in the past several years, it's become more prominent, I'd say, in the past several years, is that the quote-unquote pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement, has kind of realized that their old strategy, which was essentially equating abortion with murder and making it all about the unborn fetus, wasn't working. It was making them look like extremists. Some of the tactics that they'd use, like, barricading clinics or waving, bloody fetus, pictures in front of people and that kind of thing. That was actually marginalizing them. And I think what we're seeing is a definite shift in strategy coming from the right overall to look at how they can sort of whittle away at abortion rights by one, attacking it at the state level, not trying to push it through the federal courts or through the Supreme Court, and two, sort of wrapping it in the cloak of women's health care, making this about women. Like, for example, this idea of requiring women in many, many states in the country, for example, Texas, to undergo an ultrasound before they have an abortion. Among the many things that they may have to undergo is an ultrasound, and their doctor will then, sort of describe the fetus to them and even show them, the actual sonogram picture. All of that is deeply embarrassing and humiliating for women, but it has also been portrayed as just a basic part of healthcare. We all need ultrasounds, ultrasounds, sonograms, ultrasounds. So, why not? And in fact, it's a way to dissuade a woman from getting an abortion because she wants to go through that.
Right.
So that's an example.
And overall, I mean, I want to get into those strategies, and I want to get into the broader strategy. But let's talk about that. I guess that maybe it's more of a tactic. This pushing this notion of it. Well, let's actually start with what precipitated this change in strategy. In other words, I mean, it's one thing to say that they became sort of aware that they were getting marginalized, but how is it that there was such a concerted and almost lockstep change in strategy? What precipitated it? Where is that coming from?
Well, actually, I mean, to be honest with you, it dates back a number of years. I mean, it dates back actually decades. And what happened was, after Roe v. Wade, the anti-abortion movement, which existed in the 1970s, began to figure out, well, how can we, try to make abortion just simply unavailable at a more local level. If the federal government is going to say this is legal, is there a way to make it, if not illegal, then just basically, unavailable, or just almost make Roe v. Wade basically moot? And they were very heartened by a number of decisions in the late 80s and early 90s, like the Webster decision and the Casey decision, which in which the Supreme Court actually did allow states to impose certain kinds of restrictions if they wanted to on abortion, in the case of the health of the mother, in the case of, say, federal funding. And those kinds of restrictions then, signified to the pro-life movement that that there was ways that you could restrict abortion access, and they have been working stealthily for the better part of the past 15 or 20 years at developing legislation that would restrict access or impose these kinds of regulations on physicians, regulations on clinics. And so it's not like everybody has kind of fallen lockstep behind this. I think it's something that's been going on for quite some time. Now, with regard to the end of the kind of confrontational tactics, I mean, you still see that. If you go to, Ohio had a big, rally, I guess it was last year or the year before, over personhood, which is one of the amendments that, that they've been passing. And you see, I even on my walk to work in the morning, I see, pro-lifers, with some of those photos of bloody fetuses. So they're still out there. It's just that this is a sneakier and stealthier strategy, and it's far more successful than the prior strategy.
In some respects, and I think you mentioned ALEC in your piece, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has sort of there's a parallel here insofar as there was development of this legislation, there was development of the strategy, and in some ways it was also just sort of built to be opportunistic. That the over the past decade we've seen more concentration by the Republican Party on sort of local races, and even we're starting to see the big money, after Citizens United, start to move into local, and by local I mean state and more localized. Is there an element of simply the strategy and the legislation was out there and simply waiting for its opportunity?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the group that you're referring to is called Americans United for Life, and they are regarded within, certainly by pro-choice activists, as kind of the ALEC of the anti-abortion movement. They write model legislation, and just as ALEC, kind of pushes that legislation across the country, AUL does the same. They publish a playbook that comes out every year, and they distribute that to state and local legislators and federal legislators. They sell this legislation on their website, and they will work with you to tailor it, for your state, and they really break down all the various ways that you can go at the issue. And that's been going on for some years. It's not something that just happened in the past few years. But what did happen is that the makeup of state legislatures changed in 2010, and now you have, more and more Republicans, even in blue states like Michigan, which voted for Obama and really hasn't voted for a Republican since Ronald Reagan. They have an overwhelmingly Republican legislature. They have a Republican pro-life governor, and so you see a lot of success, at that state level, even in blue states, at pushing this legislation through. And it's all, honestly because of what we saw in 2010 with redistricting and a tremendous amount of money, thanks to Citizens United, that's flowed into these efforts. And the other point is you really can't separate the pro-abortion, the pro-life agenda and the larger conservative agenda. And I think, I noted that in my piece, that's a kind of mistake that progressives often make, is they don't really see the connection between, things like school vouchers or things like, right to work legislation and trying to restrict access to abortion or make it illegal. And they're very connected. And, you see this now even in just the focus that we're seeing when we're looking at the 2014 elections and what a big role abortion is going to play, and how leading GOP legislators are showing up to these kinds of rallies and showing up to these kinds of meetings. And so it's a very connected agenda, and I think we need to start looking at that.
Is it connected idea? I mean, is it simply a shared trait of a conservative self-identification? Is it connected because it continues to be sort of the electoral strategy of the conservative movement? Sort of flesh that out a little bit for us.
Well, I think it's a combination. I mean, I think what we've seen is that there are very few moderate Republicans left in the U.S. Congress, and certainly at the local level. People who are considered sort of moderates are they're frequently pushed out. They're primaried, quote unquote, out. So, so what you see is a sort of domination of that Tea Party, kind of very far right, very conservative mentality. If you're looking at the states, you're seeing a lot of that at the states. And so, this just follows that while, not everyone who embraces, say, right-to-work legislation is going to be pro-life, pretty much anyone who embraces the pro-life agenda will also, embrace these other conservative points because they're very much part of one kind of a worldview is what they refer to it. And this has been a long-term strategy of both the economic right, like the Heritage Foundation types, and also the Christian right. And they've been working together through foundations and think tanks and that kind of thing for many, many years, very much behind the scenes. And what you're seeing is the sort of the fruit of those efforts. I can give you an example. 2 years ago, I was covering the Republican primaries, and I happened to go to a very sneaky meeting of evangelical pastors in Florida that was held by Christian right activists. And not only were they, and they met the Republican candidates, the primary candidates at the time, and not only were they sort of presented with this view that obviously they needed to vote for, pro-life candidates, but they were also taught lessons about free market economics and why Jesus was actually a capitalist, and why they should understand that if you vote for the person that will try to outlaw abortion, you're going to be voting for the person that's going to be, right on economics. It's going to be conservative across the line. And that was a message that was sent to them. And these are the very grassroots people that then go back to their churches and they literally help register their congregants to vote. So that's how this kind of thing works. And it's just, the thing is, you don't get to see this. I truly snuck into that meeting. That's the only way I got to see it.
It's interesting because I think we played sound from, I think it was from Virginia Congressman Goodlatte, who was making the argument that abortion actually hurts job development because you presumably have less, people to care for. And it hurts job development in healthcare services, or it seemed a non sequitur, I guess, to those of us who are not sort of indoctrinated in that worldview. But the other thing that strikes me is, you mentioned sort of there has been a union over time between sort of the heritage think tankers and the evangelicals. Now it seems like it's no longer a union. They are the same people.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, that's from all of my reporting over the past couple of years, that's basically what I've been, what I've come to believe.
Well, I mean, it's interesting
pretty much
because
the same.
I mean, the dividing line between social conservatives and conservatives, it almost renders the term social conservatives, it renders it moot. I mean, in some ways. I mean,
they're just conservatives. I think that if you sit down and talk to people that you would consider kind of mainstream Republicans, moderate Republicans, what you're going to find is, first of all, a lot of them are retiring. A lot of them are saying, forget it, because they realize they're not going to win, or they don't want to serve in this kind of environment any longer. There is you can't really be a conservative any longer and not be a social conservative. And so those who object to that agenda are getting out of politics, is clearly from the number of people that have announced they're not going to run again. And you see this, I've interviewed lots of people on the state level who, quit basically the legislatures they'd served in for 20 years or something, just in the past sort of 4, 5, 6 years because of the sort of radical ideological shift within these legislatures. And so that's what's going on. And if you go to, if you go to some of these ALEC meetings, if you look at who is the state chairs for ALEC, a lot of these people are also endorsed by the big right to life groups. I mean, there's just very little separation between the two.
Yeah, and that's something I think that I'm sitting here with a couple of guys, producers who are nearly half my age, that I think for their generation, for people in the 20s, the idea of Republicans who are not anti-choice is sort of a strange concept. But in fact, the Republican Party was not always a function of a majority of social conservatives.
No, definitely not. It was really, I think it's only been in the past, however, what is it, 10, 15 years that it's really been since George Bush.
And
George Herbert Walker Bush was not nearly as far to the right on these issues. And
what was it that, I mean, and this is something that we've talked about on this program, for years, frankly, but it is, when you see it on a state level, what is it that is driving this? I mean, how did this part of the project, was it simply because the electoral power of people who are almost by definition zealots was simply too advantageous to the Republican Party? I guess the analogy I use is basically they created a Frankenstein and now they can't control it. And it give me a sense of how that works on a state level.
Well, I mean, if you go back to sort of the 80s or 90s. In the 90s, one of the very first things I ever did as a reporter, just out of school, was to do a story about the Christian Coalition and how they were organizing. These are the far-right Christian conservatives, anti-abortion and prayer in schools and that kind of thing. They were led by Ralph Reed, who is now the head of a completely different organization. But they were hugely powerful, and these guys were taking over local city councils. They were taking over the PTA. This has been a strategy for 25 years to, not necessarily focus on the federal government. That the federal government is almost lost. Forget the federal government. Make it irrelevant, and instead, take charge, or take control of your community, take control of your state, and that's what they're doing. And you see that sort of all over the place in every single state. That first of all, the people that come out and vote in those local elections are always going to be the more politically motivated, either to the right or to the left. You're not going to get a whole lot of sort of in-betweeners, because they tend to just vote in the national elections. How many people do you know really vote for city council?
Wow.
I don't know very many. I quite honestly don't vote for city council, but
Janet, you know better.
People that I know, kill me. I'm sorry. Well, but what can I do?
Let's talk about some of the specifics of what's going on in the states. I mean, you start your piece with what has been called I guess it was the anticipating the rape insurance bill.
The rape insurance bill.
Yeah, I mean, talk about that. I mean, this is not Michigan is not alone in passing a bill like this.
Right. So 9 states, including Michigan, have passed a law in which that bans abortion coverage from all insurance.
Private insurance? No, I mean, this has nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act. This is just, you cannot buy insurance.
It's not just the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
Yeah, it's private insurance. So I believe the exception to that is If you have insurance through some gigantic corporate plan, it may be a little bit different for you. Like if you work for, say, for Google or for some huge company, it may be different for you. But if you work for, your basic company, or you buy your own insurance from a private carrier, and obviously if you get anything from the exchanges, that was part of the deal, was that insurance coverage was not going to necessarily be included on the exchanges unless the states wanted it to be. The result is that, a lot of states, I think something like 20 or 25 states, have abortion insurance exemptions of different sorts from their state exchanges. And 9 states say it's absolutely not covered at all. And only one of those states, which is Utah, will give the exception for rape. So in 8 states, if you're raped, and including the state of Michigan, if you're raped and you get pregnant, you're out of luck. You're going to have to pay for that yourself if you want an abortion, or you're going to have to buy a rider. That's the really embarrassing part and the really awful part of it, is that it's basically asking women to plan ahead for their own rape. That, your insurance does not automatically cover this procedure, but if you buy a separate rider in advance of any kind of incident, then you might be covered. And from what I understand, those riders don't really even exist. But, they're sort of written into these laws that that's what you're going to have to do.
Right. The private insurance companies don't really see any value. I mean, this is, they're driven by profit, and they don't see any value in providing those riders. So they, people have to see the analogy with any other type of elective surgery that would be prohibited necessarily by law from insurance policies. I can't name any. I don't think they even exist. And so let's move to the other states where we now have seen these other type of laws which are designed to limit access. Texas, of course, is one of the sort of the leaders in this type of movement. And we should say, the idea of making abortion safer for women is obviously on its face just a rationale. But abortion is incredibly safe relative to other procedures, isn't it?
Abortion is incredibly safe. It's safer than most procedures. It's safer than a colonoscopy. It's safer than many forms of plastic surgery. These are procedures that are done in outpatient clinics. You can have these kinds of procedures done outside of a hospital setting. But only abortion clinics are subjected to a set of new regulations. They're called, they're referred to as TRAP laws. It stands for Targeted Restriction Against Abortion Providers. And what they do is they basically, make abortion clinics meet the standards of a real freestanding surgical facility, where you're going to need wider hallways for gurneys, you're going to need specialized equipment for anesthesia, you're going to need like hands-free sinks, as if this was a serious, invasive, bloody surgery. And I'm sure that if anybody from the other side of things is listening to this, they're going to say, well, it is invasive and it is bloody. But I mean, in reality, a lot of abortions don't even require surgery. A lot of people can take medication in the early phases of their pregnancy and in the early weeks, and that's how they do it. They take a pill. And other forms of abortion, the other form is obviously more invasive, but it's not a seriously risky procedure. But these laws are designed to impose these kind of onerous restrictions on the clinics, which are basically run a lot of them out of business because they can't afford to make those kinds of changes. And
we should say, I mean, you give that statistic about colonoscopies. I mean, this is actually pretty stunning. The numbers here, the mortality rate for abortions is less than 0.67 per 100,000 procedures. For a colonoscopy, and this actually makes me a little bit nervous, is about
20 out of 100,000.
20 out of 100,000. I mean, that's about 25 times plus more dangerous, more apt to cause death than an abortion. And a colonoscopy, you go in and it's like a dentist office.
Right. Right, right, exactly, exactly. And I think it's a really important. I must say, I think it's a very important statistic to give because it is a procedure, a colonoscopy, that a lot of men will undergo. No man undergoes an abortion. They don't know.
Right.
But this is it, and I really feel, it's important that, that the legislatures that are making these decisions often tend to be men, and they should understand that, look, they're undergoing a much more dangerous procedure, actually, than the women. I mean, it's not. I mean, and you have, leading medical groups, out there, the American Medical Association, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. They have all come out and said that this is a safe procedure. So it's just widely confirmed by the major medical bodies, and yet the line that is promoted is that this is a dangerous procedure, and they will seize upon the Kermit Gosnell case, which was the case in Philadelphia of the doctor that killed fetuses. Actually, he after some botched abortions, he actually killed the babies. He went to prison. He's like, a terrible example, but this is the case that the pro-life movement now seizes upon to show why it's so dangerous and why you need all these protections.
So is there a failure? I mean, on a state level, is there a failure of advocates for a woman's right to choose to effectively communicate this? I mean, because clearly, in Texas, when they say that we need to have doctors, or in other states as well, we need to have doctors who have admitting rights at a local hospital, and we know that many doctors have to fly in from out of states in a couple of states across the country because, Kansas comes to mind because, of course, there's been such violence aimed at these healthcare providers that they are afraid to be local. When we hear about these things about, you need to rebuild essentially your clinic because we need wider hallways or whatnot. I mean, is there a failure for those who want to maintain a woman's right to choose? I mean, from a communication standpoint, is there just a larger infrastructure failure? Why have they been so effective?
I think that's a really good question. I think, one, they bank on the fact that none of these restrictions seem that onerous to the average person, including, to be very honest with you, myself, and on just looking at things on face value, what's wrong with wanting, your clinic to be 100%, up to surgical standards? Who doesn't want your doctor to have admitting privileges at local hospitals? It's only when you look beneath it and realize, oh, this isn't necessary, that you realize that this is part of the strategy to restrict the access.
Right,
but
not just necessary. I mean, if it was applied to, let's say, colonoscopies, and you would have to travel 400 miles to get your colonoscopy, I mean,
right.
it would become.
Would you do it? Yeah, it would become a problem. So, right. I mean, this is, so I think that it's been very successful because they have found ways to introduce what looks like common sense legislation, but actually is not common sense legislation. And they also are funded by lots and lots of unreported dark money funders. And so when you look at the budgets of these organizations, Planned Parenthood actually spent more money in, I believe it was both 2010 and 2012, than some of the leading pro-life groups. But that's only a fraction of the picture. They receive more direct money and donations than some of the other groups, but these other groups received a tremendous amount of money that went unreported. And so they are actually, the movement itself is funded exponentially more than the pro-choice movement is. And I think that's a huge reason why this stuff is now making such an impact.
Yesterday was the Citizens United, the fourth anniversary of the Citizens United ruling, and people should understand that this, in the same way that Citizens United reinforces sort of a plutocracy in this country. People should understand that that dark money that goes to these groups as a function of Citizens United is also the real victims of this end up being middle class and poor women who don't have the economic ability to go to the next state, to take a day off, to get childcare, to get this procedure. And these roadblocks first hit and predominantly hit women who don't have the resources.
That's right. Exactly. Well, and absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for example, the campaign to defund Planned Parenthood all over the country. I mean, Planned Parenthood is in terms of offering abortion services, that's something that some Planned Parenthoods do, not all. And really, what Planned Parenthood does is family planning for young women who I always talk about this. When I was in college, my friends, myself, everyone I knew who was, 18, 19, we all went to Planned Parenthood. It was a way to, break away from our moms and break away from our, traditional doctors and our families. It was like, sort of being independent. It's where you get birth control. And, it's also obviously a place to get, for women who don't have resources, no matter what their age is, to get these services. There's been a national campaign, promoted by groups like Americans United for Life, which I said was kind of like that ALEC equivalent, to defund them. There's a war, on Planned Parenthood. That's its own separate story in a lot of ways. But that is going on, and it's going on at the same time as you have, a war on the public school system, and you have, a war on labor unions. It's all part of one large war.
Right, and it explains why people like Pope in North Carolina, who is closely affiliated with the Koch brothers, why they will fund these movements when their allegiance to the ends, or the notion of abortion is probably less than their desire to motivate and to fund basically an electoral stalwart of the right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down. It ultimately comes down to economics. I mean, you look at people like the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers, at least David Koch, has been, open and honest about his views towards marriage equality, and he supports it. They've never said anything about reproductive rights. I don't believe they necessarily have a real, strong opinion on it, but it is a way. The economic elites in our country, they need this quote unquote social conservatives, to ally with them. They need them to go vote. They're not going to necessarily get all the bodies they need unless they get this group. And so it's very beneficial for them to fund this other side of things, even if they don't personally believe in it. And quite honestly, an upper middle class, let alone an upper class person in our country, could probably afford this kind of procedure if push came to shove, if they needed to pay for it privately. But this is really hurting people who need that insurance, who need Medicaid, who need these kinds of state programs that no longer cover these kinds of things.
All right. Now, this is the point as we start to wrap this up where you mentioned the good news. I know that it's that you included some in your piece, but, sadly, I have the feeling that the good news here is far less than the bad news in this instance, and I'm sure your editor would remind you got to put in some good news here to give people some hope at the end of this. So let's do that.
We're not big on hope, no.
But is there? Is there a broader awareness? I have to say, on a national level, there seems to have been at least some greater awareness by the Democrats, at least, that there is no compromise here. And we definitely saw that in 2012. On a state level, are we seeing the sort of like tactical and strategic and organizing that we need to push back on this?
I think so. I think so. It's certainly you see people like State Senator Wendy Davis from Texas, who's now running for governor, and she became so famous last year for holding that epic filibuster of a package of abortion restrictions that was ultimately passed. But she tried to hold that off for 13 hours and made sort of national news while doing that. You see individual people running for offices that are obviously, very much pro-choice. But and you do see efforts by groups like the ACLU and NARAL and Planned Parenthood to push back against these proposals. A lot of states have these laws on their books, but it doesn't mean they've been enacted. They're frequently contested, and so there's a lot of these laws that are now wrapped up in litigation, and that is in some cases. For example, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, they took legislating abortion to the city level, which is a first time thing in our country, and the city rejected it. But as I noted in my piece, they rejected it by 55% to 45%. Only after the pro-choice movement outspent the pro-life movement by like 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. So I mean, it's not. I think the good news is that there are certainly a lot of extremely motivated activists who are making this their life's work. But the sobering news is that there are still a lot of people in our country who either don't care or who truly believe that abortion is wrong. And you're not going to change those minds, but the question is, can you change the minds of those people who are sort of on the fence?
Right.
And if you look at, say, the 20-week ban, which is the big issue now that's being talked about everywhere, that is actually making abortion unavailable after the 5th month of pregnancy. And there are lots and lots of people who even sort of theoretically support a woman's right to choose who would sort of feel a little uncomfortable with aborting a fetus at 5 or 6 or 7 months without thinking of all the reasons why one would do that.
Right.
And so that, this is something that the right banks on. And those kinds of measures have been pretty successful, actually.
Well, Janet Reitman, contributing editor at Rolling Stone, thanks so much for your time today. We will link to your piece at majority.fm. Really appreciate the chance to talk to you.